Thank you so much for taking time out of your morning to be here. I am Kate Fierce. If we haven't had a chance to meet each other before, I'm the counselor from kindergarten through 8th grade, so lower school through middle school. And I have the delightful privilege to teach in the classrooms, kindergarten through 4th grade, and then to do a lot of consulting in the middle school with their advisory program that happens in the morning, and of course, supporting students and families all the way through. So when I was talking with Dr. Bianco a little bit this fall about what kinds of things we might want to share with families this year, one of the things that came up was to sort of share our understanding of how social and emotional skills and abilities and understanding develop in the kids that we work with, and in hopes of sort of maybe sharing with you a little bit under the hood of why we do some things that we do, maybe in hopes of giving you some perspective on some things that you might see with your children or hear about happening at school, see happening at home. So we're just going to kind of do a really general overview this morning of some principles that are good to keep in mind, why it's important to know this sort of stuff, what teachers can do with it, what parents can do with it. Some really just key principles that we understand that kind of apply to all. And then I'm going to share some things that we know about kids at various ages in terms of where they are socially and emotionally. But with the caveat that you'll hear me say again and again today that there's a really wide range of what's normal. And it looks really different in every child. So just as a rule of thumb today, we're going to think that about 3 years younger than chronological age to 3 years older than chronological age is pretty normal to see in pretty much all of these factors that we're talking about. So jumping right in, it is one of the most critical things, I think, of the work we do, that we need to know the students that we work with as people and their families. And I think that that's probably true for schools anywhere. For school to reach its full potential, for a school to be able to help students to reach their full potential, you really need to have teachers, faculty who know and understand kids and like them. And so we focus a lot on being able to build relationships because we know that that is the cornerstone for the really safe, supportive environment that our students need in order to take the risks and stretch themselves and develop that curiosity and initiative that we want to see. And also to help them develop into happy and capable adults, just to have satisfaction in life. So this is in the spirit of seeing children as whole people, and more than where they might be academically on a given measure on a given day, but where they are developmentally. And then we take that of what we know about our families and where they're coming from in terms of background and culture. We try to get to know what the kids dream of, what they hope for, what worries them, what kinds of unique personalities are they bringing to the table. So we know that what I'm going to share with you are some broad truths about humans, but then you have to combine that, of course, with the unique individualness of each particular human. So nothing that I'm saying today should be taken as an absolute in that light, because there's this mix of sort of what's true for all and what's true for the individual. So 4 big ideas for us to keep in mind today before we kind of jump into like what's the work of each developmental stage. And the one is that in general, stages of growth and development follow predictable phases and stages. And you can see that in terms of physical maturation. You can see that in the way that people acquire language. You can see that in social and emotional behavior in terms of thinking patterns and cognition, in terms of how they are seeing the world. So broadly, for instance, we know that from 6 years old to 7 years old, lots of kids end up becoming a little bit more serious. That's something that we see really commonly. A little more cautious maybe than they had been previously. But we also know, for instance, that around 12, there's this real exuberance about being in adolescence and a real desire to explore all of this new stage, and that sometimes they need a little bit of extra structure and guidance around that, because that can be troublesome as much as it can be exciting for them. The second thing that we know to be true is that children and adolescents don't go through these stages at the same pace. So your personality, your environment, your just unique brain makeup means that you're going to go through these fairly predictable stages, more or less, but really within your own pace. Of course, there's some normal boundaries around those kinds of things, but really each person is going to set their own pace in how they go through that, and that 3-year developmental span around chronological age is really normal, so long as you're seeing nothing that seems really delayed or out of sorts in other areas of development. So we progress through in our own rates, and also you can see sometimes unevenness within a particular child where they might be really quick to mature intellectually, but much slower physically or socially, or vice versa. So you can see really areas where kids might be, above their chronological age in terms of ability in certain areas, but then below their chronological area, and that's really normal to see too. So that uneven pattern of abilities and skills that are emerging. And then the growth itself is uneven as well. So it's not a just linear progression that builds generally, but you often do see setbacks and stalls, times where it seems like things are moving past in a blur, and times where things seem to kind of slow down and consolidate for a period. And again, you can see that in physical development and language just as well as with social and emotional aspects too. We know that kids tend to be maybe a little bit more easygoing at some ages, maybe a little bit more sort of in the work of their growth in others. So you can almost sort of see that period of growth and consolidation happen in the way that they're viewing the world and interacting with people too. So, what do we do with this stuff? Other than be like, oh yeah, that's cool, that sounds like my child or my student. For teachers, it really is important for us to be able to understand our students, not just to be able to build those relationships that we're saying are so important, but so that you can also be able to know how to group your kids or even set up your classroom so that there are materials that are going to be engaging for your students where they are. Making sure that the topics of study and the ways that going about them match where that individual group of students is developmentally. And then also to be able to adjust with that through the school year, because kids don't stay in a static stage of development through all of a grade level. And so oftentimes in the course of a school year, a teacher will feel this particular class, this particular group of kids is sort of collectively starting to move on to a new stage of development. And so skilled teachers can kind of adjust what they're doing in terms of instruction and classroom activities to be able to capture and harness what's going on at that stage too. And then, especially as we get into the middle school ages, to be able to really talk to kids about their own development. Here's what's going on in your brain right now, and here's some things that you can expect might be going on in terms of social issues, if not for you, maybe for some kids around you, so that you can understand what you are seeing and have maybe some strategies in mind. And then of course for parents, it's important for you to be able to see where your child is so that you can make decisions about, is this classroom, is this community, is this activity, is this environment my child is in, really matching what my child needs at this moment. And then how can I better understand how my child is behaving at school and also at home? And we can talk too that there are certain developmental ages and stages where that might be kind of different, so that the student that the teacher is talking to you about may sound very different than the child that you have at home in a variety of different ways. A better behaved, a child that's struggling more with self-control, and any of those kinds of swings are certainly possible. Just want to come back to this again, because this is such an important concept, that what I can share with you today is that broad knowledge of stages that we know people tend to progress through in development, but that each child is an individual. And I share with the children when I'm in the classroom that being unique does not mean that you are 100% different from everyone around you. Being unique means that there are ways in which you have quite a lot in common with people around you, and then there are ways in which you are uniquely yourself. And so it's that pattern of commonalities and differences that really makes us unique. And so that's true in development too, that the uniqueness in your child or children that you might be recognizing as we go through some of these stages is because in some ways they might be right where we're describing, and in some ways they might not quite be fitting what we're describing, and that's expected. And one of the benefits really of having such a nice small group like this today is that if you have some questions, if you want to bring up some of those things that are popping into your head, we really have a great forum to do that. Erikson is like old school in terms of understanding development, but to just sort of almost give a metaphor for the really important tasks or work that's happening at some of the key stages in development, it still holds some good water. And so I just wanted to get us thinking a little bit about some of these fundamental, it can be what you have to learn at that stage. It can be the thing that you're sort of struggling with. It can be the kind of themes that are on your mind at that age. And then as we look at what's, kind of in the range for each age group, we can kind of think back to, does this fit with the theme that we know of from Erikson's 8 stages. So beginning in the first year or two of life, this is really the setting of our first relationships and where our attachments are formed. I have the great opportunity to work with our 4th graders and a baby. Mrs. Palazzolo's got a now almost 2-year-old or little girl who comes into the classroom, and so we were actually sort of able to teach the 4th graders a little bit about how babies' brains develop and how social skills and social emotional understandings develop. And so we can talk even with kids in that age about how important it is for us to learn that there are people in this world that respond to my needs and will care for me. And so in that first year or two of life, that's really where that fundamental psychological social growth is in the formation of those fundamental attachment relationships. And then as we get to about 1.5 to 4 years, because of course there's going to be overlaps to these stages, it really becomes a little bit more about autonomy, so what I can do versus myself versus shame, he would say. And I want to caveat here that when we're saying autonomy, we're not talking about that like, I can handle this on my own and be independent kind of autonomy. This is more the kind of toddler autonomy of willfulness and being able to assert oneself and say no. So it is really the autonomy of no, not autonomy of independence at this point. And so when a child feels like they have the ability to have some assertion for themselves in the world, that facilitates their emotional and social growth at that stage. Moving on into about 4 to 6, so that sort of preschool age, more or less, is where kids are really learning to take initiative, to be sort of the planners and the designers of their own activities. We often see that expressed through play, where they're getting really much more into free play, active play, cooperation with others, getting fantasy stories going. We are all kitty cats, we are all pirates, we are all those kinds of shared imagination kinds of group games. And through that, kids really do learn some of those skills of being able to cooperate, negotiate with others, to take a leadership role at times, to take more of a following role at times, and to negotiate that swap. So there's really, really important stuff that goes on from them being able to sort that out with each other at that point. And what can happen sometimes when we see kids who are sort of struggling to make that kind of group connection, or maybe struggling in their development at that age, is often where you get kids that are maybe a little bit more dependent on adults, maybe a little bit more restricted in jumping in with groups of kids. So that kind of maybe hanging a little bit back more on the fringes is something that we're looking for at that age, as a sign of we can encourage and coach and help a child be able to participate more fully in that group play that's happening at that moment. Moving on to school age to middle age, really like how competent am I in the world? And a lot of times at this point, social structures become more complicated, both what's happening naturally between the kids and also the sorts of activities that they're involved in. So there might be a lot more hidden social rules as you move into later lower school and into middle school about, what's kind of now cool and is not as cool. But there's also going to be a lot more formal team sport, a lot more formal sort of group activity. So they're sort of also put into positions where there's a lot more formality to some of the activities that they're taking place in. And so you need to be able to master some self-discipline at this point. You need to be able to have some of those executive function skills of planning and keeping yourself organized, not just academically, but also in terms of interacting with people socially and in more formal contexts. And then moving on into that sort of 13 years to 20 years, which I talk about in the idea of, if we're thinking up to about a fifth grader here, in that 3-year plus or minus chronological age range. You can see some signs of that sometimes even in fifth graders. It's really about who am I and who am I separate from a family or identity. And so this is where you start to see kids maybe trying on some things, maybe some behaviors we wish they wouldn't try on at times. Which they're challenging are a really normal part of their development as they're experimenting a little bit about what works for me and what doesn't. But this is also a really great time where people tend to be formulating their ideals in life. And so it's a great time for them to find people that they find inspiring and people who can be role models and leaders to them, because there's a real opportunity to develop a proud and solid sense of yourself at that point. Moving on from there, we sort of get into that, moving into primacy of more romantic relationships, into, maybe developing family, adulthood, and whatever way that may look. It doesn't have, obviously, you don't have to be married and have a family in order to progress through those stages, but just the stages that we go through in our life in terms of, as an adult, what is my purpose in the world? What have I contributed? Sort of that classic idea of a midlife crisis. I mean, we continue to have these stages as we age, and then, of course, that more reflective, maybe towards the end of our lives, we begin to really consolidate a lot of what we've learned and sort of have some wisdom and understanding that maybe we didn't have when we were young. Okay, I've been talking a lot at you, and I want to make sure that I'm getting your thoughts and questions involved. We're going to move from here to a little more specificity about particular age groups. Before we do that, any thoughts, any questions, any things you want to make sure that we hit?
And sorry I am late.
Not at all. There was some confusion in terms of how it was posted as well, so thanks for finding
I wake up with confusion as my companion. Did Erikson's 8 stages talk about the differences between girls and boys, men and women through this passage?
If we really get into it, there some in which would still be true today, and some which might seem really antiquated ways today. So it's not necessarily something that I want to embrace as like here we should all go study Erikson as a way to understand our kids. But in terms of broad psychological tasks for each age group, it's still a good metaphor for understanding where children are. But yes, some of these things you're going to see really very much true for people, regardless of where, although of course socialization and all kinds of other things can play that a little differently.
So I'm curious, because it seems that the attaching of the 5th grade to the middle school was a more recent phenomenon for Shorecrest, and that the 5th grade was previously associated.
I don't know how recently, well before my time, but
right.
Yes, there was a time at which it was
right.
part of lower school.
Curious.
At least 20 years.
Right. Wow.
At least.
So in the old days, let's put it that way, it was 1st through 5th grade is lower and 6th through 8th was middle, or however you, junior high school, or however you define it. But I'm curious in that transition between being associated more with the lower versus the middle in terms of socialization, because it feels like those that were just in lower school last year sort of ramped up into teenagers over the course of 9 months because of the socialization with the middle.
Sure. So I can't speak to what that was like when that transition happened, because that was before me. But what I can say is that it's not an uncommon school structure to, at this point, to have K4, 5, 8. And one of the reasons and the intentions there is to kind of keep 5, 6 as its own thing.
Right.
Because there is a great developmental difference between a 12 and 13-year-old versus a 14 to 15-year-old, for
Right.
instance. What ends up happening, I think, when you have a school like ours where you do have those kinds of progression is that we're able to make sure that in terms of the academic, in terms of the cognitive, in terms of like the school programming things, we can kind of begin to build that. But there's going to be a bit of a collision with social and emotional developmental truths at that age, sort of regardless of where they're housed in the building.
Right.
And so what I see happen very often is that even by 4th grade, you're starting to get kids who are kind of starting to swing up more to this, like, who am I? And kids begin to answer that question by saying, who are we? And so there's this great importance on sort of group identity, and then that's where those formal rules of like, okay, well, we've had situations where the things, schools get involved. There was a sort of a hair bow thing where it was sort of the size of the hair bow and the color of the hair bow that people were using to kind of show a group identity over the uniform. And so we have to know and look out for those kinds of things because we know they're going to happen. And I think what's also important as parents and as teachers and as just a community is that when we do know that those things are common, then we can respond in a way that says, that's not going to meet our expectations, and here we're going to help you better, but hopefully without that like, how could they be? Because we know that schools across America struggle with kids through that early middle school period really starting to say, who am I separate from the adults that have been so critical to my identity up to now?
Yeah. It's not 5th grade, and it feels like she's on the brink of teendom so quickly, and she's 11.
Yes.
I was anticipating it next year, maybe the year after. It just seems like it's happening very fast.
It does, and what happens often too, I've noticed just as an educator, is that if you have students that have older siblings, let's say, that are in high school or maybe even off at college, that sometimes they bring some of the social and emotional stages from older siblings that they've kind of picked up along the way into the social dynamic. You may have other children who are oldest or have not had a whole lot of socialization experience with kids of an older stage, and so to them it's really strange and confusing. So a lot of the social tension that I see can be strongly influenced by the fact that you've got kids that are all different levels of skill, ability, and understanding, and that are all trying to, figure it out together. And that can get a little messy sometimes. But to have the relationships with adults, be they parents, be they teachers, be they coaches, to be able to talk about those things that they see honestly, is really important to them for us to be able to kind of gel that in their heads and be able to see themselves as somebody who it is that they want to be and be proud of. Developmental milestones are not going to look the same for every kid. Just bear in mind that these are those really, really broad ages. But so we're thinking about the idea of I can do by myself, I have a voice of my own, I can assert, in sort of an age where kids are really interacting with each other in more simplistic, sort of more parallel ways generally. So you may it can be a really like wonderful time where you're starting to get that ability to not think of themselves as much but understand others a little bit better, and in that be able to take turns and share and make some friends and play cooperatively, to get that more sort of sunny, agreeable desire to please with caregivers and adults, to still really want to come to parents and caregivers for their comfort, to really still have that glorious vision of parents in childhood as my protectors and my heroes and my best role models. So it is often very fun for them to play cooperatively in this age, and you're often going to see them doing something cooperative around things that have been set out to provoke that play. So we've got a housekeeping area in the classroom, we've got a loft that's set up to be a pet shop, we've got these kinds of things to spark that more cooperative, imaginative play happening in the classroom. We are really helping them at this stage to be able to appropriately express themselves. So it's not just, no, I don't like that, but actually to be able to say that no in a way that still keeps others around you wanting to work and play with you and feeling pretty good. So a lot of, you can see what's normal, and I don't want to just read a list to you, of course, but what we see to be often those normal stages here come out of that work of, okay, I'm an individual person, and I've got a little something to say for myself. It is not uncommon at this age for us to see that some new fears begin to show up as they're beginning to understand themselves as a little bit separate from the family. That's kind of exciting and a little bit scary at the same time. And so to have a calm and reassuring presence at home and at school to help them say, hey, those fears can be really normal, here's kind of what's going on. And to be able to have that dialogue so that when things get a little too big and we want to be able to help a child more individually, that we're catching that as the adults around them. Also, to get perhaps a little bit of physically expressive anger at this stage is not at all uncommon, although no parent ever likes to get the phone call that their child has bitten or been bitten or hit or been hit. This is a stage where all of the feeling is there and all of that desire to assert myself is there, but I may not yet have the social and the cognitive capacity to consistently express that in a way that is socially acceptable. So a lot of the work that we do in terms of helping them at that stage needs to be around, okay, you feel that way, and here's a way to manage that appropriately. 4 to 5 then becomes an age where we are maybe getting a little bit more into that sort of like initiative, what can I do kind of stage where there's that active play and that cooperative group imagination that becomes a little bit more excuse me, common. So an increased attachment to interest of friends at that point is pretty common, to start to really enjoy being with my friends, being able to spend time with my friends, to hear more about friends at school, at home becomes common. But at that time too, it can be also a little bit really attached to home, so my independence feels a little scary sometimes still. And this can also come out in terms of really wanting to do it themselves, but then the next minute really have you take over for them. You can see sort of that dramatic swing back and forth between I am independent, take care of me at this age sometimes. But we can also see them beginning to be able to sort of read the social scene a little bit more at this stage, to be able to take turns and negotiate a little bit more socially at this stage. They can really pick up at this point when they're being treated like babies often, and there's that really sort of strong desire to be seen as a little more grown and a little bit more independent. And when we harness that really well, we can get them building and doing and making things and really following their own visions and ideas, which is amazing to see. But we're also going to maybe err a little side on the side of bossy or inconsiderate because we don't completely understand all the rules of unwritten, unspoken rules often of interacting with other people. And then so other people around me might be bossy and unfair quite often at that stage too. You might get a little bit more of, they are able to tell when people approve or disapprove a little more and maybe play that a little bit more too. I want to either maybe get a little bit of your attention by towing the line a bit, or I want to get your attention by being really good and doing what you're asking me to do. And sometimes both in the same kid at different hours of the same day. This developmental work sometimes is a little bit of a swing forward and then a swing back into. It can be kind of fluid. So becoming really proud of self, becoming understanding of themselves as somebody in relationship to other people, being able to understand who am I in terms of my personality, in terms of who I want to be seen as. That idea that other people might have ideas about me at this age. We get into 5 to 6, so more that like kindergarten age we're thinking now, coming into that stage of really being able to relate to people in more formal contexts, both socially and in terms of our tasks. This can be sort of that like peak of all the childhood work coming together, that you often do have very cooperative, conscientious children at this age who are wanting your support and wanting to do as you would like. You get them very rule following. As they begin to figure out what the rules are in terms of relating to others, they can become almost preoccupied sometimes with following them, and if others are following them, they begin to really have a preference for friends their own age. A lot of what's going on in terms of understanding where they might be in terms of gender roles and socialization around that is developing at this age. You are perhaps going to get, when it's difficult for self-control, that might actually be more of a verbal kind of expression than a physical expression, like we might see with younger kids that are still working to control that. And see you later. You often also at this point, because they're beginning to understand like that there is maybe some more. People don't always say to you, like, if you smile at somebody and you are kind with your words, they will tend to want to be friendly with you. Kids kind of figure this out through experimentation a little bit too. So we can see them experimenting with sort of what will kids around me do if I do this? What will adults around me do if I do this? A little bit of like social playing around to see what happens. You can see sometimes too.
Is that more conscious or subconscious?
I would say that that's fairly subconscious. Subconscious, that's kind of part of the work. Is for some kids, perhaps there's more of a need to toe the line and see how adults react. But I think for a lot of kids, it's really just kind of learning by doing. Like if the kids are natural explorers and natural experiential learners. So as I'm becoming understanding that there's maybe some order to how the social group that I'm part of in this classroom works. For some children, they might be learning that a little bit by saying, well, what if I do this? What kind of reaction do I get? And so again, sort of the more that we can understand that, you can imagine how if a teacher doesn't understand that, a teacher might be really frustrated and concerned about a child's behavior. Why do they continually provoke the kids around them? And while certainly some attention to that situation is warranted, an adult who is concerned and worried and this means something bad about the child is bringing an energy to the situation that's not going to be productive or helpful. And when we can say, yes, okay, so we're testing some boundaries with our peers and adults at the moment, that really allows us to approach it from a more constructive standpoint so that we really can think more about how can we provide the necessary coaching and support and systems around a child so they can be successful.
Can you talk more about that for a second? Because mine is this is the line, he's standing on it or putting his foot over it every day, all day at home. Mm-hmm. But at school, he doesn't necessarily do that. So I need some mechanisms for how to get him off the line just a little bit.
Absolutely.
More.
So, and we can certainly talk a little bit more individually too. A part of this, I hope, is for us to make some connections so that I can be of help. But I think, part of that is, well, for one, it's good in some ways to hear when it can happen in one environment and not in another, because that means that those skills are emerging, right? And it sometimes makes sense why the behavior that is just at that next level for a child is difficult for them to consistently perform at home, because school and all of the socialization that goes with that is so demanding, and they get home at the end of the day and their resources are a little bit depleted, and you are the most safe, secure environment for them, and so you may get that.
I get the best and the worst.
And it can still be a good sign because that ability to regulate is emerging. And so just like we don't see development consistently grow altogether, like my math and reading skills develop at the same pace as my physical maturity and my social abilities. That's, but you can see that sometimes in terms of application of skills too. And I'd be more than happy to talk some strategies at home too.
Personal fields.
If you would like. Share some resources with you, really about what's worked for some other families, because that's not an uncommon position to be. Moving on to 6 to 9, we've got a little bit bigger of a range here because also we're getting a little bit older. These phases of our life that were sort of happening where changes were coming really quickly. You're starting to steady into periods of development. This is also a really common time for us to see some of those fits and stalls of development that we've talked about, where you might see a child who maybe enters the 6 to 9 range, really well-developed skills in certain areas. You might see those areas don't develop quite as rapidly through that area as maybe other skills are developing and other kids kind of become a little bit more commensurate with those skills across the board, if that makes sense. Everybody's a little bit uneven with their development through this phase. So, okay, coming back to that idea of myself as a worker and a learner and as somebody that has tasks and jobs and things that I produce and ideas that I want to pursue. For a lot of kids, somewhere in that like junior kindergarten, first grade area, kind of is that sweet spot of childhood where a lot of those fundamental tasks are kind of well in hand. And you get what we talked about, that child very wanting to please, really sort of being very agreeable and kind of wanting to go along with things. Not every child, of course, but a little bit more common in that age. When we get 6 to 9, the brain is starting to understand the world at a level that the brain didn't before. And it's really common at that age for you to get a child who's maybe a little bit more worried, a little bit more withdrawn. It seems for me like 2nd grade is often an age where I'm hearing from parents saying, my normally happy child is really not happy at the moment. And a lot of times we can say, hey, there are some factors that might be contributing to that. But it's important to know that just developmentally, often that's maybe more of that kind of consolidation time where kids are really kind of thinking through some things and maybe are worrying more deeply about things, maybe are starting to question adults a little bit more. That idealized parent-adult caregiver is maybe starting to show a little bit more humanity in their eyes. And that can get a little bit more of resenting of being told what to do, being a little bit less compliant, being a little bit less concerned with seeking the approval of teachers and adults. And again, that can be really disconcerting to adults who have had children that before were fairly compliant. It can be a really amazing time too, as they're beginning to get that independence, to get that more kind of curiosity about things and be able to talk about it and understand it at a bit more of an adult level. But they can understand right and wrong a little bit more. They can judge their own behavior in terms of their own standards of right and wrong a little more. Sometimes they have fairly extreme ideas about the world and what they need to do that they haven't necessarily tested out loud with adults. They're just sort of beliefs they hold on to. And because it's hard to feel guilty about things, sometimes you'll see a little bit of that. Like there's a hiding or a guiltiness that kind of can come out in that age a little bit too. Really, the ever-increasing addition interest in friends and group acceptance. You might also get that sort of starting to get some of those early markers of like we are a group where we're whispering to each other, or we want to have markers of our friendship somehow, or we are this club, or we are this group. That kind of more of a group identity beginning to show a little bit there too. Moving 9 to 12 years old, we are maybe beginning to get into that even more adolescent identity development on the horizon. And so you may see in this age some kids that still feel quite young, like maybe some of the previous stage. You may find kids in this age group who are actually feeling like they're pushing the upper ranges of it, or maybe even a little bit more teen or adolescent. That's all really normal. And as I referenced earlier, sometimes the social tensions that occur at this age can be traced at least partially back to what an enormous variation of skills, ability, and development levels are going on at this time. So as we're starting to think more about ourselves, we're getting more into puberty and having some of those hormonal influences that might come up. The more important that my social world is to me, the more important that my friendships are to me, then the more important all the variations in how those relationships feel are to me. The more acutely I feel the good times, the more acutely I feel the bad times. And then we as adults caring for kids in these ages often feel very acutely those highs and lows too. And while it's not fair necessarily to say that that kind of up and down swing is normal throughout that whole period, what is true is that most kids do hit a point somewhere in that, I would say, like 4th to 7th grade, where maybe just things are feeling a bit out of sorts for them as they're kind of moving through this part of development. So it's maybe a little bit more embarrassing to be close with your family, at least show that outright. It is really important for us to still be able to believe in adults, but we probably can see through them more clearly if we're not walking our walks. But just talking the talk, kids can really begin to pick up on some of that difference, and it matters. And it begins to matter even more as they accelerate towards adolescence, because they can often feel like they are beginning to figure out what's right or wrong, what's my code, what do I need to be able to do. And so I need to be able to consistently apply that everywhere I go, and my parents, my teachers say I need to be able to do that, but wait, they're not doing that themselves. And it's not that we need to be superhuman, or that we're not allowed to make mistakes, but I think it becomes an age where the more that they're able to honestly interact with adults around them, the more that they're able to get a healthy idea of what it means to be an adult human being with some flaws and some strengths, and to be able to accept those things that maybe are harder for you or where you're not as strong, so that you can work on them and to know really where you're good, and that you can accentuate that. They learn all of that from watching us, not to sound like an old 80s PSA, but they really are watching adults in a very intense way, even as they're maybe beginning to focus their interactions more on their peers at this point. Do the thing, listen to the music, see the show, wear the shirt that a friend has done. It's a tumultuous time in terms of social development, it's a tumultuous time in terms of physical development. And so, to get that maybe a little bit more moody, a little bit more quarrelsome, a little bit more sensitive than normal, can all be really normal at that point. As we move into that real adolescence age, you get back to that idea of parents aren't perfect, learning from adults when we can see them as flawed human beings. Feeling awkward about yourself. I think there's also something to our social media society where people are able to present very pretty images of themselves and very cultivated peeks into their life, and it's important for us to help kids at this age recognize that everybody has an external self and an internal self, and that when we are constantly comparing what we know to be true about ourselves on the inside to these very polished social media images that others are putting out there, we're setting ourselves at a disadvantage. We're holding ourselves up to an unrealistic standard that even those people aren't necessarily living up to every day. So just the nicest stuff goes on Instagram, just the nicest stuff goes on Facebook. It's always really almost touching to me at this age how much you can see the younger child come out, particularly when they're stressed. So it's sort of a reminder that this very adult self that they're beginning to project is often kind of unstable. And they don't feel it in 100% confidence yet. And so, again, to have those relationships with parents, teachers, coaches, adults that they can trust and speak authentically about with their experiences is really important, so that they've got an outlet to understand and process what can be really changing all the time for them. You might get a little bit more of that interest in privacy and independence, kind of like out of my life kind of thing, as they're beginning to assert that independence. But the secret is really that if you do totally give them all of that, that feels pretty insecure for many of them. And so it's that balance that we have to strike between allowing them to become young adults, but also making sure that we are giving them that support for when they might revert back into a more childish stage. Okay, so there's a really wide range of what's normal at every age, I guess, would be one of my big takeaways. And that figuring this stuff out isn't easy for quite a lot of kids, and that a lot of the struggles that we see in terms of behavior, both at home and at school, or a lot of the struggles that we might see kids having with each other socially, we can understand them in this developmental framework, and that can actually help us understand maybe what skill we need to help that child develop to be able to help that situation improve, or what kind of support or understanding we can provide to them while they're kind of learning to see the world in a new way, in a new stage. This is an incredibly useful resource for parents, and some of this is in my slides and some of this is what we've talked about. But just for one, I think developing an understanding is really important, because that helps us sometimes keep ourselves in that mindset that we need to be able to effectively handle things. I think it is about knowing where to push and knowing where to maybe kind of provide a little bit of a soft resting spot with a lot of this, because kids aren't going to progress to another skill until they're ready. They're not going to progress into another stage until they're ready. We talked about how everybody's kind of got a different profile. Things are all developing at different paces. So what can happen sometimes is that we're actually faced with a child's not ready to do this yet, not a child isn't willing to do this thing yet. And so for parents and teachers, we can sometimes hit those points where we're banging our head against the wall. Why isn't this getting any better? And so when we can understand that as developmental, perhaps it helps us take that breath and kind of get through that stage as an adult. With older kids too, I think sometimes talking to them a little bit about, these are some things that kids your age are thinking about sometimes. These are some things that kids your age are feeling sometimes. Do you ever think that? Do you ever feel that? Using this as a framework for talking with them about what they see, not just in terms of themselves, but in other kids too. So it can often be a lot easier to talk about what you see in someone else than what's going on in you. And so as adults, we can use that as an entry into conversation. And I think also just to keep this in mind as, you can use these stages, these milestones, as frameworks for conversations with teachers and with pediatricians and with other adults that are involved in your child's life, to just kind of help them to get an understanding too. Like, I can see that maybe things are developing really quickly in terms of this, academically, but I'm worried that maybe some of the social understandings are lagging a little bit behind it. It sort of helps you be able to talk to teachers as well. Always happy to talk a little more individually about kids if you want to talk about yours in particular. But I think it becomes really like a language and a framework for understanding for us.
You made that comment about not so much developmentally able versus not willing to. How do you know which is happening?
So I think, for one, is knowing sometimes is this a realistic expectation for a child at this age? So when we understand sort of what's in the normal ranges, then we can know if our expectations are appropriate and in line. But I think then what you start to be able to tease out, is this an emerging skill, is when you can maybe see it applied in certain settings and not in others. And one that I love to say, for instance, is it can be really difficult for kids to learn that skill of being able to hone in on something that they need to attend to and focus. But even children that might technically qualify as having a diagnosis of like ADHD, for instance, can oftentimes really hyper-focus on things that are of high interest, like a video game, for instance. So what you can start to do is take those little kernels of where it's being applied, if it's in some environments and not others, some things they like to do versus things they don't like to do. And when you can see that it's not happening anywhere in any context, then maybe that's just a skill that's not there yet. If you're starting to see that it's in some situations and not in others, then maybe that's emerging and it's something that we need a little structure to. If we can do it pretty flawlessly in one setting and we're not doing it in another, then that, you know, that becomes, if I can hear at school the teacher say, go to your locker, take out your binder and your book, and come back to your desk with a pencil. And I can do those things in a classroom setting, but when at home, I'm asked by a parent to go into the playroom and sort the toys into their bins and sweep up what happened in the corner and then come back for dinner, I'm not following those, then there's probably something that's a little bit more of a won't. Exactly. But fundamental work of childhood is to know that we all have to do things that we don't want to do sometimes. And adults, we can model that often.
So in that situation, my kid loves hockey. I make games out of the cleaning up. Is that counter to, like, you should just go do what I say, man?
So, I hear that a lot too. But I also think that when we know sort of how we can make something become more appealing, we give them the opportunity to experience what it's like to have the satisfaction of the work. So sometimes we need to get them into the experience so that they can benefit from it, and then that helps them to begin that internal motivation. So we say, like, we scaffold like a building, we're going to provide this around you while it's being built, but then hopefully over time you can begin to remove those and have it be more of an internal drive. But you got to be able to taste that success for yourself, really, to be able to have that drive to do it again. And so we can, as adults, help them get that taste. So, as I said, I'm happy to stay for a little bit. I don't know if people feel like they need to go. Please don't feel like you have to stay. So stay as long as you like. Get going when you need to.
I love that book. I've had it for a long time. You recommended it when Olivia was in kindergarten. Is that just a new version of it?
So yes, they actually just came out with a new edition.
Okay. It has
This past year. So this goes through, this is ages 4 to 14, and there's some really lovely things about developmental principles in the beginning, but then it'll go through each age group. And so, like, here's 4-year-olds, and then it'll give you a little bit of a narrative of sort of, what a 4-year-old might be like, some idea of what they're like at home, typical growth patterns physically, socially, and emotionally, in terms of communication, language, and literacy, in terms of cognitive capacity, and then how those relate to reading, writing, and math in the classroom, and also across the curriculum. So this can just be a really great reference point. Remembering also 3 years in either direction of the chronological age of your child, to just sort of see where are we and what might be coming next, and what are sort of those really central themes that we can support. Yes.
So those behaviors I might broadly categorize into positive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
Since development is somewhat sequential and cumulative, is a certain amount of negative behavior necessary for the development? Therefore, as a parent, and I think about your comment, they've got to experience that to get to the next level.
Yeah.
And I know that it doesn't mean turning the car upside down, lighting it on fire.
Right.
Extremes.
Necessary is an interesting word, but yeah, I mean, I think it may actually be necessary, and in that children are naturally experiential learners, and so that which they experience in themselves, the social consequences, the parental consequences they experience themselves, are more effective often than hearing about what's happened to a peer or hearing what happened to you when you were a child. That need to really experience that themselves, that fosters that growth. And I also think that when we protect them too much from the consequences of their actions, or when we protect them too much from all pain and harm, which is a completely understandable urge, but that there is some skill and some learning that's acquired from a struggle a little bit, that can ignite both cognitive capacities and social and emotional capacities, that maybe need to have a forum to be brought out into. I think what is really powerful is when we as parents and educators are able to sort of allow them, or even sort of foster those conditions where they can experience those things young and small, so that the situations and the people involved themselves are both young and small.
So if the first time that you're really having to deal with the fact that if you're overly bossy and opinionated with your peers, they might not want to deal with you. If you're not learning that lesson until you're 16, then you might have really entrenched behaviors and some really deep wounds with some people around you. But if we're able to see that in a child and say, hey, this is pretty normal, but let's make sure that we're also developing some empathy and some negotiation skills and some problem solving skills so that we're putting that all into a healthy direction, we're letting that child have that struggle and experience in a way that we can have more control over. Better to learn the lesson of being able to go against your peers, being able to say no when they're doing something that doesn't feel right to you. Better to learn that with maybe a mean video in 4th or 5th grade than with substance abuse or with relationship pressures when we're in high school, that kind of thing. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you so much for coming out
you.
on an early morning.